actually happen. And you could, in fact, intervene halfway through and move policy by doing a similar calculation, by running it always backwards. But you do have to be able to run the model backwards to do that, or run it forward so fast that you can run it backwards. We're not actually running it backwards.
Sorry, I missed the last little bit of what you said because I was reading the chat to respond to Freya. But you're still, unless you covered it and the bit where I was distracted, you're still thinking about it in terms of a particular model. So then you would need to do that with a range of models, presumably, and somehow put those together.
That would do it with one model, and you need to do it with a range of models.
Yeah.
And then you could see where they agree. That would be, in a sense, rather than trying to combine them, you might want to just find if all the models agree in a certain, you do these things, you get to a good place, then that would be really good. If they don't agree, then you need to ask questions about why they don't agree.
Yeah. So you really need to be in a position to do that sort of thing. You need emulators probably set up for a range of models, don't you?
You need emulators. I think there are some really simple models you could just run on themselves, but for big models that take 3 hours or whatever, you can't do that. You cannot span space. But if you can build an emulator that runs in a tenth of a second, you can. Now that adds an extra uncertainty, but we can include that because we know what that is. So you end up with, normally you think of starting off somewhere and start somewhere and you end up with an uncertain outcome. But I'm going to start with a certain outcome and see what the uncertain input was that drove that and got you to there. So instead of models doing that, we're going to do that. Except you can have a range here. You don't necessarily just need to have a point. So I need to be in this area. I need to reduce I want to get it between 0.6 and 0.8. And therefore, all these outcomes would get you in that region. And I think it's quite an interesting way to look at decision making with a model. Danny Williamson's done some stuff on it. He did a thesis. I don't know anyone who's done it in epidemiology because Danny did it with a climate example. We tried to get it funded by NERC for landscape decision making, but they didn't like it. No, they did like it. They didn't fund it. Let's change that. They didn't have a lot of money. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's the other issue, although I suppose in the context of COVID, money is no object. But,
I think
Peter, doesn't it really come under interventions rather than politics and policy?
I don't know. I think of it in terms of setting policy.
Yeah, I think it would be. It might be that one would want to mention it somewhere in the modelling. I'm not sure about interventions particularly, but in the modelling thing. But I think Peter's right. Here you're thinking very much of the policy endpoint and getting there rather than which is rather than trying to sort of predict forward or something. So I would have thought, it might get mentioned in more than one place, but this does seem a very good place to put it to me.
I think of an intervention as a policy, in a sense. Something, someone's making a decision, and this is a decision support tool to actually help them decide. And I think that's policy, but it might not be. It might fit somewhere else just as well. I think the problem is that it needs a bit of theory. It's not a thing probably we could do tomorrow. Well, we could try it, but in some ways I'd quite like to try it on something really simple just to prove that it works, because I like doing simple things first. And in that sense, maybe it's a next pandemic issue rather than a this pandemic issue, but it might be, you could say, how do I roll out vaccines? How do I roll out vaccines to cut numbers? And you could build a model where you make certain people immune and see how that works. And that would seem to me to be an intervention you could model this way.
Really nice. Yeah, it would be good to see if we can find any examples of it being used in epi. I have used it in previous other fields, but not in. I've never seen it in epidemiology.
One of the things I when I was distracted, I was realizing that Freya had made me host. So I started the recording, but I'm afraid that was only halfway through Peter's thing. So hopefully we can reconstruct the earlier bit if necessary.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I'm sure we can.
I think I've got some written stuff about it, which
Yeah.
talks about landscape decisions, but I can change that to epidemiology.
But the recording is going forward now.
So I think a lot of people said they might not be able to make it, so I assume that they have not been able to make it. I think Duncan said he was going to try and join this morning, but he had a lot of teaching, so we might get people pop in. But if we assume this is the group for now, do we want to take a look at the sort of combined list? So it's on the Dropbox.
That could be good.
I think, well, my plan of action is to discuss the points, see if there's anything we want to add or take out. And then I'd quite like to group them into the headings, and then, well, we'll see how far we get. But I think a future step, or perhaps immediate step, would be to sort of divvy up the topics for people to kind of think about in small groups over Christmas. But depending on how much we want to add or take out or discuss, that might not be today.
I mean, just starting at the very top, where there's the comment about not clear whether it's a matter for research or simply implementing better practice. I mean, it may not be that modelling per se can add a great deal, but I think it's a point that as modellers, we are, you know, really well placed to make the point about communication of uncertainty and evidence and so on. So I think it needs to be in there, even if it's only in the introduction rather than as a specific challenge. But I think it is a challenge just to try and get people to understand what scenarios are and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think there's two challenges. One is to get people to understand that models aren't perfect, and the other challenge is to understand that because they're not perfect, that doesn't mean they're not useful. Because a lot of people think, you know, you spend a lot of money on a huge computer and what's going to come out is going to be the science, like following the science. And then when you break it to them that no, they are uncertain, they start to say, well, that's no use then. And there's that fine line between being informative but not being perfect. And I think that is a policy thing, or it may need to link to somewhere else that says that. But I think that is an important part of policy.
One of my lists I put down interventions, and that three things. I mean, first of all, that
did you ever think about having an early cup of coffee? No. do have the coffee, Dennis.
No, I was being asked if I needed coffee, and I've stolen a march by making.
Tell Jenny we'll all order one. Sorry, do go on.
Is he muted to us? Dennis, are you speaking to us or your wife?
Sorry, I was muted by mistake. Sorry. That part of communication is you've not only got to communicate uncertainty to the public, I suppose the basic thing is you're trying to keep the public on side. And you've not only got to communicate uncertainty, but you've also got to communicate that that may well mean that you change your mind about what the best interventions are as a pandemic develops. And, I think both those things are very difficult politically. That, politicians, as you say, they like the idea that if the scientists are going to be involved at all, that they'll turn the handle of their large computer and out will come the science, which they can then follow, and everyone knows exactly where they are. And it's worse, and it's worse than that. That first of all, there's the uncertainty, and secondly, they partly obviously because of the uncertainty, you may be a month or two down the road, and the scientists all suddenly say, actually, this isn't working. This pandemic, thinking through the next pandemic, we thought this pandemic was going to be a bit like COVID-19, but actually, bother, it isn't. We've tried all the things we learned from COVID-19 and they're not working, or they're making the, we've got to try, and we've learned from the data that there's some other options and we suggest you should change to those. Well, I think that's, that makes it even worse in terms of getting public trust. And you really need if you've got a sort of rock solid base, the way it looked as though they had in New Zealand, though, perhaps it wasn't, tested to destruction or whatever one says, but then I'm sure these things are possible. But I certainly think in the kind of atmosphere we've had in this country politically, that these kind of things really do cause trouble.
But some of it's always going to depend on who the leader is. Because some leaders have to communicate uncertainty in a sort of gentle fashion and prepare their populace, and the others want to give a definitive answer. And I'm not quite sure how much anybody can ever influence a person who wants to give a definitive answer to the country. So some of the communication issues, I don't think we can do anything about, but at least we can try and make sure that our communication within government is as good as possible, and that we have mechanisms of communicating to general public that don't sound like we're all arguing with each other.
Yeah, I think that's true. We can't be responsible for what other people say, but we can at least tell them the best information we have. And that's true with the public. We can give the public the best information we have as well. But we can tell the civil servants and the ministerial advisors as well as we can. And then what they say, unfortunately, we can't control.
Yeah, I agree. So do we want to split communication into two? Into those two themes? So
You're going to be quiet, Lisa.
oh, sorry. Yeah, there's an issue with my microphone. Can you hear me again?
Yeah.
Yes,
That's
quite.
it.
It happens a lot. Do we want to split communication up into well, in any number of ways? Do we want to split it in the ways Peter suggested? So sort of uncertainty and then the fact that it's still useful. Or if we're going to have it as a common theme, we could keep it as it is and discuss.
Well, maybe provisionally divide it and then see how we go on, just sort of pencil in a division, as it were.
Yeah, I think that one's going to go across lots of these challenges.
Yeah.
Documents.
Is it the place to start? It doesn't feel like the place to start communication to me, but then looking back at the 2015 volume, I see that the first challenge was communicating the limits of modelling there. So obviously other people have gone this path before us. I mean, I think I would have started with the what you call long-term thinking and preparedness.
Yep.
And I suppose
yeah, they're not in any order, so feel free to suggest.
Yeah, and I think I'm also, maybe I'm sort of stuck at an earlier level of thinking. I'm still personally trying to think through the politics, and we're probably not. We're probably trying to keep references to politics to a paragraph or two in introductions, that kind of thing, rather than perhaps saying it's a challenge, because it's quite a long way from being a challenge for our skills as modelers. But I just feel it colours the whole thing. You know, I think a lot of the discussion, I mean, Peter's excellent suggestions to do with how you go about setting policy are sort of assuming you've got a background rational environment. And, you know, it's quite plain that at a high level, that you absolutely cannot rely on that.
Yeah, I think that's, I suppose my model has a rational thing to a certain level, and then it sort of becomes irrational.
Well, I suppose what I'm doing here is I'm giving
not a very good model of how the world works.
I think I'm giving advance warning that I think if I can manage to get my thoughts down on paper, that they're essentially going to be a prequel.
Yeah, no, I think that's good, because it will put it into context, and I think sometimes we have our own context, which is not actually the world's context. As you say, we live in a nice rational world where everyone would do everything with nice loss.
I think I think if we're going to discuss politics, we at least need to outline what the I hesitate to call it irrational, because politics isn't entirely irrational. People do things for reasons. We may not like the reasons, and we may think they do the wrong things, but they sort of have we need to set that sort of great jaggedy background to where we can contribute.
I wonder, I'm not totally convinced, but it's just an argument anyway, that long-term thinking and preparedness comes at the beginning, because to some extent it might be easier to write about that when we've said, you know, what we need now, as it were. If you might be better able to see what's needed for the future if we had more of an understanding, or have discussed the points about where the issues are at the moment. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a nice point. It's almost a reflection of what we feel is needed for the next one.
Yeah.
You know, if we say we want to set up the best structure for decision making, we need to have said first a bit about what sorts of decision making we're envisaging and where we think we can help and so on. But I don't know, it's just a view.
Yeah, gosh. Well, let's not bother about the order too much. Let's
because I think when it's written, I think there needs to be some introduction that says about the importance of evidence-based decision making, but I don't think that's a challenge, because I think we all agree on that. I mean, some people, politicians, might not agree, but I suspect everyone involved here thinks that evidence-based decision making is a good thing, and that models provide good evidence, and therefore in some sense that is a context that this is always living in, and this in a sense is the detail that fills that out. It's more about how we do it we're sort of assuming it's a good idea.
Yeah.
So if we're not worried about the order for now, shall we just go through each sort of challenge as I've grouped it? And feel free to add in any sort of comments. So does anyone want to add anything more to communication? So it's worth noting we have discussed sort of more things in previous weeks that are on the Word document, but this is just taken from people's top 10 lists.
There's the communication between modelers or modelers writ large with associated fields, I suppose, as well as both to sort of so these policy and general public are sort of external communication, but we also need good networks of internal communication between different sorts of experts and modelers. Well, actually, it's there a bit at the bottom, isn't it? Direct communication between modelers and field scientists, but that's specifically in the context of data. But I think it's more general. It's making sure that we have good communications right across the broad field.
So I think you can split communication into at least 3 areas. So you have communication to the public, communication to government, and communication within science.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a good point. Is to make it clear which lots of people need to communicate better with whom.
And moving on to this section, which I've just named competing factors. So I guess other types of science that come into decision making.
Well, yeah. Actually, I mean, I think it's key to having science-based policy that you try and integrate the science. And when I say integrate the science, I mean include the economics in that, because I think that I mean, I think the big problem, a big problem, and I'm sure it's not only in the UK, is that you get politicians who see they're getting, let's say, scientific advice coming from one source and economic advice coming from a completely different source. And when they try and sort of put those two things together, you end up with very, very much a political decision, which can easily, where you can imagine a scientist and a modeler and an economist getting together and agreeing, isn't this completely daft? That they're clearly doing, it for some particular political reason, but it doesn't make sense from either of our points of view. If only we'd sort of been able to explain how the modeling and the economics meshes together, they couldn't have made such a bad decision. I mean, obviously, how you do it is partly much easier said than done. But
I think it's still worth mentioning, even if we're not able to say much about how to solve these challenges. And then the next one I didn't really group with anything. but I felt it would probably come under the sort of detection emergence type stage of an epidemic. So thinking about sort of when to react and sort of when to take action, basically.
Yes, and of course that's
That's the trickiest.
that's very much tied up. I mean, that's absolutely tied up with uncertainty, isn't it?
And economics and public confidence.
And the international aspect. So all of the above, really. Yeah.
And it's
And that's where having preparedness is. So you've got models that are already able to look quickly at, and if you've already researched potential diseases, then you have a better idea and you can communicate what the likely impact is, and you can run your models quicker, more quickly even. And so it comes under preparation, I guess. And that is funding in advance for diseases that may never become anything of importance.
yes, I mean there's a UN classifications, WHO classification scheme, isn't there? And doesn't seem to have, well, necessarily been terribly helpful in this situation, but that classifies diseases on a scale of sort of 1 to 5 as to whether how worried you should be about them. Where, I think where it's largely in terms, I think, of expected case fatality rates. That a disease with potential case fatality rate of less than 0.1% is sort of level 1, where perhaps countries aren't expected to actually take much action through to, and by the time it gets to 1 or 2%, it's getting up to being something you definitely need to take action to prevent. So maybe it's not very sophisticated, but
and how country specific is it as well? So trying to make a value that applies to all countries.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's right. And I mean, I think there's certainly an initial perception with the COVID-19 that it was going to be much worse problem in the developing world, and that was, and we in Europe would all be relatively unaffected, but we should be thinking charitably of all these poor developing countries which are going to be hard hit and doing something to help them. A month or two later, it turned out that this was completely wrong. I suppose that's that's a part of preparedness, isn't it? Is to becoming a better judge of new outbreaks. I mean, this is the kind of thing that, WHO is probably the right level for this to happen at. And I think one of the things from the point of view of politics that's well worth looking at quite carefully is the reasons WHO system hasn't been as helpful as it could be.
Do you think WHO is the right, I mean, in one sense, it's the right level, but
each country has to have their own level as well, Valerie. No, I agree.
Yes, no, clearly. Yeah. But do you think that WHO is able to react quickly enough? And therefore, is it that by the time that they've acted, it's a bit late? And so you really need your own system in advance of that. I don't know. I mean, I it's not anything I know much about. But you just imagine that these big bodies will be really quite sort of cumbersome to.
Well, no, because I mean, WHO. Surely WHO's role, as I understand, in pandemics is to provide wake-up calls, early warnings to governments around the world. So,
But weren't they
you know,
also,
they were starting to they were saying things about COVID-19 pretty promptly. They're reporting in a very one could go through the sequence of what exactly they reported when, but so they were doing their job there. I mean, but maybe what they were saying was with hindsight not the most helpful thing to have said, so the one we're talking about at the moment, which I haven't thought about much, and I haven't read why people made that deduction, but undoubtedly it seems to be the case that there was a misjudgment as to which countries would be worse affected, and then further down the line, well, no, and then there was the whole thing about interventions regarding cutting travel being pretty strongly recommended against by WHO. And I've read a bit about the sort of history of that, which seems, just seems such an odd, again, with hindsight, it seems such a bad bit of advice that it's well worth looking at the story behind that to see why they gave that advice. And again, with the whole mask wearing and aerosol transmission things that where they seem to be giving the wrong advice up to a stage at which scientists were beginning to be fairly well agreed that it was the wrong advice. So I think sort of WHO or international, whatever you do internationally, really needs to work better. But I don't think it's slow, Valerie. So I think that's what you were suggesting. You were suggesting that countries might react quicker, but I think actually, if WHO had been listened to, I think WHO told countries enough that they really have no excuse for not being more careful, and in many cases going into lockdown a bit quicker.
Do we know, and again, it's just my own ignorance, do we know, I mean, it is a health organization, so are they entirely focused on health? One gets the impression not, in the sense that they're taking a longer or a broader perspective at least. To what extent they're, in advice about travel, for example, or face masks, that they were weighing in things that weren't wholly concerned with just the narrow business of stopping the immediate spread of the infection. Are they looking at economic factors and more broader health issues down the line?
I think they were looking at economic factors, and they were taking a pessimistic attitude that realistic travel controls were only going to delay things, they weren't going to prevent them. And why they thought that is a bit difficult to disentangle. The background apparently is that there was an outbreak of, I think, some kind of flu in Surat in Western India. I think it was around about 2005, and a big fuss was made and travel was shut down, and then it turned out that only 50 people died, and people said afterwards that there were many other worrying outbreaks of that sort of size that where they hadn't done that kind of reaction and they hadn't caused problems. So in other words, it was thought to have been shutting travel down was thought to be an overreaction. And WHO seems to they seem to have fairly strongly influenced their policy from then until now, I suppose. I thought that the shutting down of international travel was very helpful in SARS. It was part of how SARS was got under control, but I'm not sure that's the universal view. So, so I think, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort. I think this is a sort of common thing in crisis situations that that how do you tell early enough which ones actually are the big one, and so because if you end up appearing to cry wolf too often, then this becomes difficult politically, and then you also have the consequences of taking action. So I remember one. One form of defence, for instance, against a wide area electricity blackout is to try and island the system while it's happening to isolate the problem area. But this is in practice impossible to implement, because trying to island the system it typically would have worse consequences than the original fault. So I guess you have this possibility of ending up putting in very pretty severe restrictions in place, and then the way that political processes play out, everyone thinking, well, actually, you just told us to do this thing, and it because it succeeded. You get into the possible situation of people saying it's effectively because what you advised succeeded, it shouldn't have been advised.
Yes, well, that's yes.
I suppose that kind of issue is very much on my mind, because the reason I was spectacularly late for this call is that I had a huge overrun on a previous call about electricity security of supply, and one of the points we were talking about there was this sort of interaction between what, in some sense, as a rational group of people we might wish to happen, and how that comes together with with how political decision making works. And is it the case? And is it the case that the sort of the judgments or beliefs of political level about what matters and how things work are, in a sense, the reality? Or is it something where you come to a sort of mucky practical compromise, or is it something where you take a slightly more you stick with your own views as to the way things should happen?
Very difficult question, I think we'll agree. So Chris, we've just been looking at a new document which I put in the Dropbox. It's called Policy List Combined, just a quick Excel spreadsheet where I've combined the suggestions that people sent in and sort of grouped them generally. So we've just been sort of going through the points and kind of discussing anything, and we've just been discussing when to react, so when to take action.
Yeah. So I'm actually still having some problems accessing that. So maybe on the Dropbox I should just communicate with you offline, because unfortunately I have another call at 11, so I'm making a fairly fleeting visit to the discussion today. But I'll just take offline, just get with you and Dennis, getting myself access to the Dropbox.
Have you not had an invitation to it, Chris?
Yes, I have. That's why I'm confused.
No.
Anyway, let's just sort that out by email afterwards.
Yes. Let me know. Yeah, like
so the next one I've gone for the heading sort of international cooperation. So points made that there are a lot of sort of duplicate efforts, and I guess we should have more international cooperation. So comment made, when funding multiple groups working on aspects of the same pathogen, we should be bringing together those groups to enable expertise sharing, to build networks of experts and ensure mutual respect between disciplines. Those are the comments we've got. Does anyone want to sort of add or?
I just wanted to counsel against the idea of one sort of mega model, because I think varieties of modeling approach is a good thing, but it would also be good, I think, if, because different countries probably do have different approaches, to actually run Italian models in Britain and British models for Italy would actually be a good thing, because you get that spread of different approaches to modeling.
Sure.
It's a question of to what extent the model structure is appropriate, and it just needs the parameters to be appropriately adjusted.
It does depend on that, but I think certainly in climate, there are people who push for everyone to have the same model.
Sure.
But that can be a really bad thing, because model structure matters.
No, I think it matters here too, since we don't really know what the.
Yes.
I mean, we can't build a model that represents everything. So.
But clearly, you don't want a model that's really tied to Italians' social structure being applied in the UK. But I think for some of the less finely tuned models, that there probably is some benefit in running different countries' models, having been slightly more tuned to the UK, just to see if there's a big difference.
But I think the difference is surely, I mean, I think a bigger really in epidemic models, that you'll get people who are just doing completely different things. Like some are actually, the ways they take account of population structure. I mean, they're just models all going to simplify that in some way to make it tractable, and there just are quite a few different ideas as to how you simplify it to, and whether you put the emphasis on different types of people, or whether you do it more by where they live, or the network of how they interact, and I think coming back to the duplicate effort, I mean, I think the modelling approaches tend to be international. I mean, take any particular, say, network models of whatever sort you like to think of, you'll find that the people interested in them are probably spread around the academic community around the world, so what am I trying to say? So the problems of, I suppose the duplicate effort is
I think you can subdivide models into different categories that are trying to achieve different aims, and then the parameterization of a more complicated model is going to make it not necessarily transferable to another country, but the more parsimonious models are probably already being used in the countries where there are a well-developed modelling team.
I think that's a good. I mean, I think transferable is a good word there. I mean, the question is, you might well have, you might well look at the modelling that's been done in Italy, let's say, and say, well, actually, we didn't build in that aspect into our models. It looks like it's important. Perhaps we ought to try building that in.
And I mean, I think on the use of running multiple models in parallel, I think we would all agree that certainly that there are benefits from doing this. I think there's a very important messaging matter, which is that which is the usual one about it's not the case that if you've simply run multiple models, that's job done in terms of considering uncertainty. And I think this is a, I mean, that is something that often comes up in different scientific areas. This and I think the obviously this is something. So looking at multiple models, particularly in an emergency situation like this, is something I think we would recommend. But I think we also need to that needs to be twinned with reminding people of the importance of good practice with respect to each model individually.
Sure.
I should just also say I'm going to have to disappear in a minute because I'm going back to electricity security of supply for another call.
Right. Well, thanks, Chris.
I'll try and do better with my diary next week. Anyway, bye.
Right.
It's gone.
Eating visit. Yeah, very good points. Anything else we want to say on cooperation, international cooperation? Okay, so the next one, I haven't really grouped with anything, but we probably could group it. Just a sort of point about, I guess we mentioned this earlier, allowing for changes in response over time as we see that things aren't working or new information becomes available.
And so that's a politically challenging to change intervention strategies. So it's going to depend on your timescales. So we can't each week go, and now everyone's got to stop. Now you can start moving again, because that's when the public start complaining that we don't know what we're doing. Yeah. Also, there's a temptation to change too quickly because an immediate change in figures isn't observed. So there's an assumption that the policy is having no effect by the general public and by some politicians.
It's a really nice point.
I think that comes back to the communication part, that in a situation like this, we are learning that the science isn't fixed, that we're learning about a new pathogen, and to start off with, we don't know that much about it, and as we learn more, but I would suggest that the science should change faster than the policy, that unless you find something's drastically wrong, you shouldn't change the policy as often as you change the science, that the models are going to learn, the parameters are going to get better, everything's going to change, but you only change policy when it's changed so much that the policy needs to change. So I think there's a time, the different timescales, and the policymaker shouldn't try to change as rapidly as the model is, unless it's going to materially affect the output.
You've got when to react and you've got when to adapt, I guess, would be.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, that's really nice.
I think that's
And both those could well, particularly this one that we're talking about now could go up with the communication. It's all part of that communication point.
Well, I think part of it should go into interventions, and that's, I think, as I say, part should perhaps go into communication. Because I think in the interventions paper, the point's already been well made that you need to take account of real world behavior and public reactions to interventions.
I wasn't.
Obviously going to include changes.
Yeah, when I wrote that one, I wasn't only thinking about behaviour changes due to interventions, but more, you know, the in general with epidemics, people change their behaviour depending on their perceived risk, and their perceived risk might be, you know, how many cases there are around them amongst their, how many deaths there are amongst their immediate circle, you know, all sorts of things which are or in some way reflecting the level of infection out there that aren't specifically policy statements or interventions. But certainly I know many people who will say, you know, people react as long as they're not aware of any infection in those around them, they tend to relax. If a member of the family dies, then this is suddenly it all becomes much more real.
Yeah.
And if the Daily Mail tells them to do it.
Oh well, I wouldn't know about that one.
Newspapers do have an enormous influence on behaviour.
Scary.
Yeah.
Okay, so we might like to move that one to communication.
Yes.
Yes, I think.
Well, yeah, when to adapt is not just about communication, is it? It's about
No, that's a different one.
Yeah.
Okay, so we could split it.
Oh, you've gone quiet again, Lisa.
I need a new laptop. I said, yeah, we could split it. You're right. Not all of it would go into communication. Yeah. Okay. Well, we can think about where to put it. Okay. So long-term thinking and preparedness. There's quite a lot of points here, so you might just want to take a quick look. I think the first point is important, sort of setting up structures for surveillance, decision-making and logistical support. But I don't think we'd be able to say much on how you might do that. Not much more than just mention.
Well,
focusing only on human diseases.
Sorry, say again, Karen?
Are we focusing only on human diseases in this paper?
and I think I spoke across you.
Sorry.
I missed the beginning of your sentence. I only picked up the bit you said something about human diseases, but I missed what you said before that.
Is this paper focusing only on human diseases as the next big crisis, as opposed to another Dutch elm crisis or another foot and mouth crisis? Oh, you've done silent.
Yes. I would cast this question to Valerie and Dennis, but my instinct is human diseases.
I just thought.
I think the thought was human diseases, but I think
Yeah.
you know, I think should we call it the elephant in the room? Be aware of animal diseases too.
I think if we think what the other sections are discussing, it is very much, well, human pandemics and the move across into from, you know, the animal human interface and so on. So I don't think, I mean, one might be able to make the odd point in passing or use something from animal plant diseases as a sort of illustration, but I suspect it would just make it too broad. We'd need to bring in too much extra expertise that we don't have at the moment if we really wanted to bring. So in the same way, we can make odd remarks about techniques that have been used in, I don't know, weather forecasting or something. You know, methodology that might be useful here, and we could make those sort of points.
I think the methodology is interesting, Valerie, because I think the relevance really would be if, as I suspect we do, we take rather different attitudes to surveillance and preparedness for livestock diseases.
No, I think the methodology part.
I think methodologically, I think it'd be good to make comparisons that are appropriate. But the overall focus, I think, is you're right. I mean, I think it should be human diseases.
I think it's worth making that point that a lot of these things would also help with things like foot and mouth. Actually, a lot of these things would help with climate. They're actually, a lot of those questions are the same question. The details very different, but a lot of the things about having systems for data collection, having systems for getting quick access to big computers when you need them, are very similar. And having that sort of infrastructure would help, but it's not, I think, the main focus. I agree that it's a sort of byproduct.
In terms of the modelers, many of the modelers that have worked on COVID were modelers that worked on BSE and worked on Scrapie, worked on plant diseases. So from an epidemiologist modeler point of view, the disease doesn't matter. The host doesn't matter. So the techniques we're using are similar. And so they kind of come under a much closer umbrella than, say, climate change does, because it's the same set of people doing the work. And so, yeah, I guess why I'm asking is, so plant diseases is something that's quite overlooked and not trendy. It will be trendy, though, if something like worthwhile for Neil Ferguson to model comes along, then he'll jump on and push us all out of the way. So it's that kind of, and the animal diseases is definitely the same group of people switching between them, human and animals, whatever is the big current political paper generating honeypot, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of overlaps, as you say. I mean, for example, at Cambridge, all of the epidemiologists are based in, well, either veterinary or plant sciences, even though they only do humans. So there is certainly a lot of overlap. I also think we can have there's a lot of examples that we can draw on the policy side from previous animal outbreaks and plant outbreaks, animal disease and plant disease outbreaks. For example, as you said, foot and mouth disease would be another big UK one.
They haven't started ring culling yet on COVID.
Problem is,
Well, yeah.
banning cattle is much easier as well.
Yeah.
And we had a cattle tracing system, so we can see where they've all gone, so we can trace them all back. And trees are even better; they don't move.
Yeah.
I was thinking that, yeah.
Unfortunately, insects on them do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so the specific interventions will probably be different for humans, one would hope, but certainly the sort of communications between policy might be interesting to look into.
So surveillance. So I don't know much about surveillance for human. I mean, I know there are Sentinel GP networks in most countries. Beyond that, I don't know. Does anyone have expertise? So it's.
I know people have been
there are
talking.
already good structures in place, and that wasn't the issue. So we definitely knew that COVID was coming. Early cases were found. The issue was what to do when those early cases were found. So I don't know how much surveillance for human diseases is an issue.
But if you're looking for disease X rather than for a specific thing, it might be.
How much is that a modelling question, though, I guess, rather than a medical or a...
Yeah.
But then certainly the logistical support does need modelling input so that it's set in a sensible, epidemiologically driven way rather than like the test and trace.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so moving on, integration of modelers into the decision-making process. So I guess how modeling is used and how modelers are used. I've kind of grouped all under this point. The only thing I didn't add in that was mentioned in an email to me was also who is doing the modelling, and who decides what questions are asked.
Well, I guess that second point sort of comes under this co-creation of models a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's true.
In terms of who decides the questions.
I think one issue with COVID has been the very large number of cooks wanting to be in the kitchen.
Yes.
And maybe the dominance of one or two chefs. And how do you balance that out so that you don't have lots of people providing unhelpful input, but you don't equally get rid of people who would provide helpful input? I don't know how to put it. I mean, Julia tried to put it in her Nature paper, didn't she? Kind of stop sending me your physics models. I think maybe with her.
But that's always been the way. I mean, I remember many papers I got in sort of in the 80s where people were dusting down models for one thing, and suddenly it was all HIV, but they'd been developed for, I don't know, something totally different, not even a transmissible infection. I think, you know, I don't know how you stop that. You just need a mechanism for screening, good refereeing and screening it out.
So I think partly this is where we sing the praises of the IDP.
Sorry?
I think this is the praises of this programme for allowing genuine modelers to come forward. But I guess, again, there was a a slight element of invitation. So it was definitely networking in that people invited people that they knew.
Yeah.
And so some groups may have got left out. But I know there was a feeling from my group, because we do lots of large scale modelling and we offered help on the ramp and were completely ignored, and decided then to get on with locusts and stuff instead. But there was an element of there, some groups, and the same with the veterinary epidemiology groups, who have a large number of postdocs with expertise in modelling biological systems, were pushed out of the way. And how you deal with that, so that you don't have, because there are now a large number of groups doing epidemiological modelling, whereas when I started out, there weren't. And part of it is that those group leaders have seeded off groups, that have developed groups. And so not everyone can contribute and get a sensible outcome, but how do you set up those systems so that you do make the best use of, and that you don't get one or two groups always dominating, and so their models dominate, and then.
As I understand it, I mean, we haven't got Kira, who knows about this better than me, but my understanding is that a couple of groups, specifically Imperial and the London School, have had funding on, pandemic type modelling,
Yes.
so that they would be prepared and ready to step in. Now, so you've got two groups, and two big groups, who are funded long term specifically for this expertise, and so it's sort of inevitable, given that structure, that they are going to dominate, at least in the early stages. And I don't know what way round you have, because clearly you do want some groups that are maintaining some sort of expertise, but clearly there are downsides in terms of other people feeling excluded and being excluded, not just feeling excluded to some extent.
Yeah, I've been wondering about whether there's any kind of practical way to construct an epidemic network consisting of not of victims of disease, but people who are interested in studying it, and whether you can have peer reviewed, like so where you I mean, I think for it to work, you obviously need quite a lot of transparency in terms of data being available and shared and so on, but you also need some kind of sort of recommendation scheme, and I can see that's difficult because people jump on it or manipulate or whatever, but just as I wonder whether the whole formal refereeing through journals might not just get replaced by posting on freely available sites like arXiv and medRxiv, but coupled with a sort of recommendations thing, where again, I mean, you recommend where also somehow that you look at who's done the recommending, so you can't just get 100 totally ignorant people to weigh in and say this is a 5-star paper, that should have no effect unless the 100 people weighing in actually have some kind of track record of understanding things. So I mean, you get things like eBay, for instance. You have trusted sellers with feedback and this kind of thing, and
I think
potentially if someone can find a way of making that work, I mean, it wouldn't, obviously it would be very helpful, not just in this field, but
I think there's been quite a lot of criticism in a way of that method, because you get big names coming back publishing nonsense, but because they're a big name, they get published. Another way to turn my question around actually is, so the government already did, as you said, funded a group to do pandemic modelling, several groups that were ready for emergency response. Did they actually need extra help, and in what way did they need extra help? So was it that if they'd had the facility to second some postdocs to run their models, that would have been enough? So how much have other modelers really changed or been needed in changing policy? And how much is it because it's affecting us all, we want to help, but maybe we're not needed?
Yeah, I think, you know, at the start, everyone wanted to help, and a lot of people weren't very helpful because every physicist thought they could write a better model than the existing ones. And I don't know whether having some open source models that they could have played with rather than start from scratch and write their own model. Because I know a lot of journals spent a lot of time in the spring just rejecting bad epidemiological modeling papers. But if there had been, you know, one decent open source national model that they could have played with, they might have actually generated useful stuff rather than just writing 1,000 SEIR models that really didn't tell us anything. Yeah, I don't know how you know, clearly when something like that happens and it's a national emergency, everybody wants to help. And you want to let them help, but not hinder. But I think in this case, a lot of it did hinder.
I got the impression just from Julia that there was a need for extra manpower. I mean, experienced manpower of the sort of postdoc level, or maybe research students as well, simply because there was so much to do in the way of running all these models and so on. But beyond that, but that was sort of extra manpower rather than people doing their own thing.
Which is rapidly making funding available to second those from other universities.
Yeah.
Which could be a recommendation.
Yes, I'm not quite sure how all that works. I mean, certainly I know of people, postdocs on one grant that sort of put that on hold for a bit while they went off to work somewhere else. But I don't know where the funding, presumably from the current groups who had some available funding to pick up these extra people, or maybe they were given more funding.
I think initially Cambridge was offering up, kind of saying they would cover the cost, but it didn't really take into account that your DEFRA grant on something else wouldn't get completed then. So it was an issue when I was working at the Veterinary Laboratories Agency with BSE, in that they moved lots of people over to working on BSE and didn't get other grants finished. And at the time that was great because they got all the BSE stuff done as quickly as they could. But then a year down the line, a couple of years down the line, they got wrapped on the knuckles for not completing other stuff.
Did the people not go back and complete?
They did, but within timescales, and you have university assessors coming and assessing a research institute, telling them that they should have not done that. So, I mean, that's a difficulty in who assesses who as well.
Yeah, but I've got two postdocs who've done not what they were supposed to do over the summer because they've done COVID stuff. Now, in this case, the funders, the Alan Turing Institute, and I think I'll go back to them and say we did COVID stuff, and they'll say fine. But if they'd been doing something else, maybe they wouldn't have said fine, and I would have to say, I'm sorry, but 6 months of the grant was spent on something you didn't really want us to do.
I mean, they're two rather different things, aren't they? Yeah, sorry. There's people come in from outside, and a few, I'm sure a few have brought really useful ideas, but an awful lot of people who simply just haven't had time to get up to speed to really do anything very useful in epidemic modeling. But then you've also got a lot of people who spent in some cases many years on epidemic modeling, but were not part of the Imperial College or LSHTM circuit, who might have been able to improve the work that those bodies were doing, but who probably as much as anything, just for reasons of time and logistics, have not been able to contribute on that. Similarly, I mean, a useful, it'd be useful to have international cross-fertilization, for instance. I mean, it would be, I don't know whether anything of this has happened, but it would be, if you imagine a government depending on a couple of bodies, a couple of academic groups in this country for their main modelling and advice, it'd be interesting for them to get people who are dealing with the problem in the US or in France or Italy to come and look at what we were doing, and to say, oh yeah, it's very interesting, we can learn from that, but also actually there's some other things we're doing which we've found useful, and so I suppose I'm saying that using the existing body of epidemic modelers, both in other countries and from groups not well connected or not that well connected to the so-called leading groups, was perhaps more of a loss.
I wonder, I mean, Peter was talking about all those early papers, and I wonder if, all this extra manpower is actually counterproductive, because somebody has to review all these things, even if they're ultimately getting rejected. So people's attention is being distracted from the main task by having to just cope with all this voluntary manpower that wants to get involved.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of time and logistics involved, even if ultimately it's useful, and not all of it will be useful. But I don't know how we say any of this, so I'm not sure that it is.
Well, no, or I mean, to make my example more specific, you might well have people who've, let's say, been criticizing the imperial model for years on the basis that it doesn't include these things it ought to include, or models some aspect in a way that is not very realistic or whatever. And when suddenly the imperial model really matters an awful lot because it's being used as the basis for important decision making, those people might wish to be heard and have their views taken into account. And you can think of all sorts of reasons why that doesn't happen as much as it usefully could. But how you have a system where those things work better, I don't know. I mean, I suppose we have is there a root problem, for instance, in the competitive research funding and research status in this country? The system of competing for grants and having research assessment exercises which say your department's 5-star, mine's only 4-star or whatever. These are not exactly inducements for people to collaborate, are they? So
I think there's an issue with funding that's for government direct funded research. So we managed to hold the tender for plant health modelling for the last 5 years. Somehow we got it all. And then on tree diseases. So we were the go-to, and then it's changed. So they put a new tender out and 5 groups got through the tender stage. So now every small grant they put out, we all have to compete with each other for. And there's an algorithm, because it's government, that it's going to be, we've got scored on our original application. We don't know our scores on each component. And each the decision on who to fund will be a balance of what we propose to charge for the work and the scores that we got in that tender. So, which means that if we really want a piece of work, then we have to underfund how much it's going to cost, probably, because it's a mysterious algorithm. And we're competing against these groups. So we're not working together to have a good plant health model. We're working on a shoestring for the good of the country rather than so yeah, the funding model makes it less likely. So now whereas previously we had standing capacity money with the model ready to go, we now compete for each little disease, and we're being funded on slush funds at the moment within the group to enable that standing capacity to exist. But basically it's being covered by other stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have to go. Sorry.
I need to go.
Thank you for joining.
Okay, bye.
Right. I suspect we all need to
Wrap
wind
up,
up.
yes.
So,
Yes, I mean, I think there are. I think challenge. I'm trying to phrase it sort of really broadly. I mean, challenges in getting the best expertise to collaborate in a pandemic is obviously a multifaceted problem, isn't it? Because I think we've talked about several different things that would all bear on that. So
It's funding, QDOS.
So I think that you could call that a policy challenge, couldn't you? I mean, you could. Yeah. Anyway, Lisa, is there anything else we should? What have we got? We've got at least one more big section on modeler specific challenges, and then a small section on taking action.
Yeah, do we maybe want to meet next week to discuss those two and then think about an order or sort of?
Yeah, and I'll try and write something of sort of prequel nature, including, I mean, for instance, one thing I'd like to sort of maybe do a digest of some points I've learned from is the New York Times has been building up a series of looking back at the pandemic and quotes, things that went wrong and things that went right, and it does seem, compared with the papers I tend to read in this country, very, very well referenced. It almost always gives you a link to the actual scientific paper or whatever it's based on. So so one can dig down and into some of these sort of background things. I think even if we feel that the kind of points they're making or that we might make along those lines are too much political rather than modeling to be feature here as challenges, I still think they're such a huge part of the background. We've got to refer to them, even if it's just introductory remarks. A short remark to the effect that someone should go and bang a whole lot of international leaders' heads together so they don't do counterproductive and unhelpful things like anyway. But thanks, Lisa. And I guess if anyone would like to, maybe you could, with the little rearrangement we've suggested of moving one or two items around, maybe you should be inviting people to, particularly with these categories where there are half a dozen or more points with a single heading, ask people if anyone would like to try writing a text to sort of put those together and try and focus them on things that could be called challenges.
Because there are quite a few people who have, excuse me, you said that you got quite a few responses and presumably we're not all here at the moment.
Yeah,
so
quite a few are very keen, but
so maybe if you do that, maybe people will have a go at trying to combine some of these points into a paragraph of prose that might be useful.
Very good.
Excellent.
So, how close to Christmas is it? We still have.
We've still got a couple of weeks.
I think I'm being optimistic.
Well, no, we've got 1 week, haven't we? Next week will be I think the
Last
last
one,
week
yeah.
before. I think we were anticipating that sort of IDP activities would stop at the end of next week, if that's the 19th, I think it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we have 1 more week, but hopefully then people might have a little bit of time over sort of Christmas, New Year break to work on bits. and do
How are the other
writing.
papers going?
I'm sorry?
How are the other papers going?
Very variable. Some are doing quite well and some have barely started. So it's mixed. It's a question, you know, people have different amounts of time and so on. But they're all underway. So hopefully over the next few weeks, things will get together.
And the aim's to put them all in one special issue, so they all need to be finished, or the last one determined.
No, we can.
No, we've had that in discussion already, Karen. And the good news with epidemics is that it will be mainly online, and if not entirely online. And also, I think that they have a system whereby they're prepared to start putting an issue online before it's all filled up.
Yeah, so we
So you
thought that
can
was
imagine
quite
having when you've got, say, if you've got half a dozen papers, they might put that online together with a. Yeah, so hopefully we don't have to wait for whoever's the slowest.
which is good.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
See you next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, see you
Right.
next week.
I'm going to stop recording now if I can find out where to do it. Done. Right.
Okay.